The wooden cross that hung above Pine Ridge's main street cast a long shadow across Charlotte Walsh's face. She stood with her head bowed, not in prayer, but in silent defiance. 18 years old, with auburn hair that caught the late afternoon sun, she might have been beautiful if not for the hollow exhaustion in her eyes. Her hands, pale and trembling, rested on the swell of her belly. 5 months with child and already the subject of the town's most vicious whispers. The crowd had gathered in the muddy thoroughfare, their faces a sea of stone masks carved with righteous judgment. Women clutched their children closer, as if Charlotte's condition might be contagious. "Don't look, Martha," one mother hissed, turning her daughter's face away. "That's what happens when a girl forgets her place before the Lord." Men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. The blacksmith, whose own daughter had once courted Charlotte's friendship, now stared at the ground as if the mud puddles held profound interest. This was not a trial in any legal sense. It was a public execution of reputation, a ritual cleansing of Pine Ridge's moral fabric. The town council had met behind closed doors the previous evening, and their verdict had been unanimous. The girl must go. At the center of it all stood Reverend Jonathan Walsh, Charlotte's father. Tall and severe in his black coat, with eyes the color of winter sky, he addressed the assembly with the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades interpreting God's will for others. The distance between him and his daughter, barely 3 feet of mud and dust, might as well have been an ocean. "The Lord commands us to cast out that which corrupts the body of Christ," he declared, his voice resonating across the hushed gathering. "As it is written in Corinthians, put away from yourselves the evil person." The Bible verses flowed from his lips like poison. Charlotte had heard them all her life, first as comfort, then as warning, now as weapons. She didn't raise her eyes to meet his. She didn't need to. She knew what she would find there, not the anguish of a father losing a daughter, but the cold satisfaction of a man eliminating a stain on his reputation. "Charlotte Rose Walsh," he continued, using her full name as if to separate himself from any connection to her, "has brought shame upon this community and upon the house of God. She has surrendered to base desires and now bears the evidence of her sin." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Abernathy, the postmaster's wife, clicked her tongue loudly. "Just like her mother," she whispered to her companion, not quietly enough. "Apple doesn't fall far from the tree." Charlotte felt a single tear slide down her cheek, not for herself but for the child within her. A child who would enter the world already branded with judgment. A child whose father was hundreds of miles away, perhaps not even aware of its existence. The father of her baby was Jacob Miller, the eldest son of the wealthiest family in the county. They had loved in secret, exchanged promises under starlight, dreamed of a future together. His family owned the lumber mill that had built half the town, and Charlotte knew they had ambitions far greater than seeing their heir married to a preacher's daughter. They had been careful, meeting only in the abandoned hunter's cabin by the creek, always with plausible explanations for their absences. Jacob had spoken of asking for her hand once he returned from his studies in Boston, when he would be in a stronger position to defy his father's expectations. Charlotte had believed him, had held on to those promises as tightly as she now held to the child growing within her. But when her condition became known, betrayed by morning sickness that could no longer be hidden, the Millers had swiftly sent Jacob east to Boston a full month ahead of schedule, claiming the need for proper education. Before Charlotte could even tell him about the child, he was gone. His last letter returned unopened, marked "no longer at this address." "For the protection of our flock and the preservation of God's covenant with this town," Reverend Walsh proclaimed, his voice rising to its full thunderous potential, "Charlotte Walsh is hereby banished from Pine Ridge." A small canvas sack was thrust into her hands by a church elder. She felt its meager weight, a day's worth of cornbread, a small jug of water, perhaps an apple. The barest gesture of charity, just enough to absolve them of murder in their own minds. "Until she repents of her sin and is cleansed of her impurity," her father continued, "she shall not set foot within our boundaries nor receive comfort from any God-fearing member of this community." As the crowd began to disperse, her father approached. For a fleeting moment, Charlotte thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or some last vestige of paternal love. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, and whispered words meant only for her. You have your mother's corruption in your blood, a sickness in the soul. Now go, and may the Lord have mercy on your damned spirit, for this town will not. The words cut deeper than any knife. Charlotte had little memory of her mother, Rose, a gentle woman who had died when Charlotte was 8, officially from fever, but surrounded by whispers Charlotte had never fully understood. Until now. Her mother had been beautiful, with the same auburn hair that Charlotte had inherited. She remembered soft hands that smelled of lavender, a quiet laugh, and bedtime stories that weren't always from the Bible. But she also remembered the tension in the house, her father's disapproving glances, the way her mother would sometimes stare out the window for hours as if searching for something beyond the town's borders. She was too gentle for this world, the town women had said after her passing. Now Charlotte wondered if gentle had been their euphemism for something they considered far worse. The great wooden gates of Pine Ridge groaned shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her bones. Before her stretched the Colorado wilderness, a vast, unforgiving expanse of dust and rock and scrub pine. Behind her lay everything she had ever known. Charlotte took a single step forward, then another. Each one carried her further from her past and deeper into uncertainty. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly, transforming the world into a shimmering haze of heat. Mountains loomed in the distance, indifferent to her plight. We will survive, she whispered to her unborn child, a promise she had no idea how to keep. Night fell with the sudden chill characteristic of the high desert. Charlotte had walked until her feet bled, following a game trail that wound through scrub and stone. When she could go no further, she sank down beneath the twisted limbs of a juniper tree. The stars emerged, countless and cold, spinning in their ancient dance across the vast dome of the sky. Charlotte had never seen them like this, away from the lanterns of town. Their beauty was almost cruel in its indifference. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the slight movement within, a flutter, a promise, a defiance. I don't know if we will live to see tomorrow, she whispered, her voice barely audible, even in the profound silence of the wilderness. But I swear to you this, I will not abandon you as they abandoned me. Whatever comes, we face it together. The words hung in the night air like a prayer, not to the God of her father, but to something older and more primal. A covenant between mother and child, sealed with nothing but will. Sleep claimed her eventually, a fitful thing punctuated by dreams of running and thirst. When dawn broke, it brought no relief. The water jug was half empty already, the cornbread hard and unappetizing. Charlotte forced herself to ration both, knowing that each sip and bite might be the difference between life and death. The second day brought blisters that burst and bled inside her worn leather shoes. The mountains seemed no closer than they had been the day before, a cruel illusion that taunted her with false hope. She found a small patch of berries, familiar from childhood foraging lessons, but they did little to ease her growing hunger. By the third day, their cornbread was gone, consumed in small, careful portions that never satisfied. Charlotte tried to distract herself by watching a small lizard that darted across the rocks. With desperate hunger driving her, she attempted to catch it, imagining some meager sustenance from its tiny body, but her movements were too slow, too clumsy. The lizard disappeared into a crevice, leaving Charlotte with nothing but scraped palms and bitter disappointment. The water lasted until midday on the fourth day. As the last drops passed her cracked lips, Charlotte felt a primal fear grip her chest. Without water in this heat, death was not a distant possibility, but an imminent certainty. The landscape began to shift and blur at the edges of her vision. Once she thought she saw her mother walking beside her, but when she turned, there was only the endless, empty scrubland. On the fifth day, she could go no further. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed under the meager shade of a scrub oak. The fight was draining from her with each shallow breath. This was to be her grave then, an unmarked patch of dust in a land that had no name for her. As consciousness began to slip away, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision, Charlotte became aware of a presence. Not the angels her father had preached about, but a shadow falling across her face, blocking the cruel sun. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and still as the mountains themselves, watching her with unreadable eyes. Fear, cold and primal, pierced through Charlotte's exhaustion. She was no longer alone, but whether this was salvation or a new torment, she couldn't tell. The figure knelt beside her. Through her blurred vision, Charlotte saw a face weathered like the land itself, deep lines carved by wind and sorrow, skin bronzed by years under the harsh sun. His eyes were dark, holding the patient wisdom of the wilderness. He was dressed in buckskin and wool, worn but well maintained. His hair, black threaded with silver, was tied back from his face. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a pale line against his weathered skin. Without a word, he extended a worn leather water skin toward her. Charlotte reached for it with trembling hands, her dignity forgotten in the face of desperate thirst. The water was cool and tasted of minerals and life itself. She drank deeply, each swallow bringing her back from the edge of oblivion. When she had finished, the stranger took back the water skin and without a word turned to walk away. Panic seized her. He was leaving. Her momentary savior was abandoning her to the inevitable. Something broke inside Charlotte then, not hope, but the heavy cloak of victimhood. A different strength surged through her exhausted body, born of rage and desperation and the fierce will to live that had sustained her this far. "Wait!" she called, her voice a ragged croak. He did not stop. "Wait!" she shouted louder, the sound tearing from her raw throat. The man paused, his back still to her, a silent question hanging in the shimmering air between them. Charlotte knew her next words might determine whether she lived or died. She would not beg. She had been brought low enough by the pity and judgment of her own people. "You walk away from one life," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "but you leave two to the vultures. Does the mountain you call home not care for new life? Or is your heart as barren as this ground?" The silence that followed was absolute. The man stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, a statue silhouetted against the blinding sun. Then slowly he turned. His eyes were not angry, but they were not kind either. They were unsettlingly perceptive, as if they could see through skin and bone to the secret she carried, to the shame her father had branded her with, to the flicker of defiance that now kept her from collapsing completely. He walked back and stood over her, his shadow once again falling upon her. This time it felt less like a threat and more like judgment. He studied her swollen belly, then her face. For the first time, Charlotte saw something flicker in his eyes. Not pity, but a deep, ancient sorrow, a weariness that seemed to echo her own. "The mountains do not care for the weak," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the first words he had spoken. "They claim them. That is their way." "I am not weak," Charlotte countered, the words tasting like a prayer and a lie all at once. "I am surviving." He let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh in another life. "You were dying when I found you." He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "I will not be your savior," he said. "I have no charity for your world or its people. But the spirits of this land do not favor a needless end." He paused, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "So I will make you a promise, little ghost, not a bargain. A promise. You will follow me. You will learn to be silent. You will learn to listen to the wind and read the stone. You will work until your arms ache and your legs tremble. You will forget your gossip, your father and the town that threw you away." His voice dropped even lower, becoming almost a growl. "You will become a creature of this place, or this place will devour you. If you cry, if you complain, if you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand. That is the only mercy I can offer." It was the cruelest, most terrifying offer Charlotte had ever received, and it was also the most beautiful. It was not kindness or compassion. It was a chance, a path forward that was not a path to a grave. He was not offering a hand to hold, but a cliff to climb, and he would be watching to see if she would fall. Charlotte looked from his hardened face to the endless, hostile expanse around her. Her choice was simple: certain death alone, or possible life with this dangerous, solitary man. Using every last ounce of her will, she pushed herself from the ground. Her legs shook violently. Her body screamed in protest, but she got to her feet. She stood before him, unsteady but upright, a girl of 18, pregnant and abandoned, covered in the dust of her own near grave. She met his gaze and gave him the only answer she had left, a single, determined nod. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if she was following. He knew she would. The journey to his world was a silent, grueling pilgrimage. The man, who had still not offered his name, moved with a fluid, grounded stride that seemed to ignore the punishing terrain. Charlotte stumbled behind him, her breath like fire in her lungs, her legs trembling with the effort to keep pace. His promise echoed with every agonizing step. If you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand. The fear of being abandoned again was a more potent fuel than food or water. It pushed her onward past the point of exhaustion, until her world narrowed to the sight of his back and the burning need to take just one more step. The heat of the afternoon gave way to the chill of evening. The man showed no sign of slowing, no acknowledgement of her struggle. Once Charlotte stumbled over a hidden rock and fell to her knees. Pain shot through her, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She glanced up, expecting to see him disappearing into the distance, but he had paused, his back still to her. He did not turn, did not offer help, but he waited, the smallest concession to her condition. After what felt like days but was likely only hours, he led her through a narrow gap between two towering rock faces, a passage so well hidden Charlotte would have walked past it 1,000 times. They emerged into a small, secluded valley, a secret world of stone and shade. A thin trickle of water cascaded down a rock wall into a clear pool, the sound a balm to Charlotte's frayed nerves. The valley floor was dotted with juniper and pinyon pine, hardy plants that had found life in this protected pocket. The surrounding walls rose high, sheltering the space from the worst of the wind and sun. It was like stepping into a different world, still harsh, but with the possibility of life. His home was not a cabin or a shack, but a shallow cave carved into the valley wall, its mouth veiled by a curtain of ancient vines. Inside, it was Spartan, a testament to a life stripped to its barest essentials. There were sleeping furs, a blackened fire pit in the center, a few clay pots, and tools that were elegantly simple and brutally effective. Along one wall hung an array of weapons, a bow of exquisite craftsmanship, several knives of different sizes, a tomahawk with a worn but polished handle. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a complex aroma of sage, pine, and something earthy that Charlotte couldn't identify. This was not a home, it was a den, a place of function and refuge, devoid of comfort or sentiment. It was a reflection of the man himself. "You will sleep there," he said, gesturing to a corner where several furs were piled. "The water is there, brother." He pointed to the pool. "Do not waste it. It is all we have until the rains come." These were his only instructions before he turned away, busying himself with kindling a small fire. Charlotte sank onto the furs, every muscle in her body screaming with relief. Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come immediately. She watched her silent host through half-closed eyes as he moved about his tasks with practiced efficiency. In the dancing firelight, she could see details she had missed before. A scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The careful way he handled a small leather pouch that hung at his belt. The strange mixture of wildness and discipline in his movements. Near his sleeping place, she noticed a stack of books, an unexpected sign of education or at least literacy. "Do you have a name?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused in his work, not looking up. For a moment, Charlotte thought he would not answer. "Ethan," he said finally. Just that. No surname, no further explanation. "I'm Charlotte," Wu offered. "Charlotte Walsh." "I did not ask," he replied and returned to his task. The rebuke was clear. Names meant connection, and connection was not part of their arrangement. She was here to survive, not to be known. As the fire crackled and the first stars appeared through the cave mouth, Charlotte felt a strange peace settle over her. She was still in danger, still vulnerable, still at the mercy of this stranger in the wilderness. But for the first time in days, she was not actively dying. For now, that was enough. That night, when Ethan had retreated to his own sleeping place on the opposite side of the fire pit, Charlotte slipped out of the cave. Her body protested every movement, but she needed to see the sky, to breathe air that wasn't confined by stone walls. She found a small outcropping of rock that jutted from the valley wall, offering a view of the hidden sanctuary. In the silver light of the moon, the small valley was transformed into something almost magical. Shadows dancing among ancient stones, The pool reflecting starlight like scattered diamonds, the hushed whisper of the breeze through stunted pines. Charlotte lowered herself carefully onto the rock, wincing at the soreness in her limbs. She placed both hands on her swollen belly, feeling the slight movements of the life within, stronger now, as if responding to their change in fortune. "We made it through today," she whispered. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I promise you this. I will become whatever I must to keep you safe. I will learn what he teaches. I will be stronger than they ever imagined possible." She looked up at the vast sea of stars, so much clearer here than they had ever been in Pine Ridge. "Your grandfather spoke of heaven up there, waiting for the righteous. But I think perhaps there are other kinds of salvation, ones he never understood." Charlotte thought of the church in Pine Ridge, with its rigid pews and suffocating doctrines. How many times had she sat there, listening to her father preach about a jealous God who demanded absolute obedience? How many times had she felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her, even before her transgression? Here, under the infinite sky, those teachings seemed small, petty even. The wilderness had its own harsh laws, but they were honest ones. Serve or perish, adapt or die. There was a purity in that she had never found in her father's sermons. The cool night air caressed her face, soothing her sunburned skin. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The betrayal, the loss, the terror of near death. Tears came then, silent and cleansing, falling onto her hands like baptism. "I'm scared," she admitted to the night and to her child. "I don't know if I can be what he demands. I don't know if I'm strong enough. But I have to try. For you." Unknown to Charlotte, Ethan watched from the shadows of the cave entrance. His face remained impassive, but his eyes held a complexity of emotion he would never have admitted to. There was respect for her determination, a grudging acknowledgement of her strength, and deeper still, a recognition of something in her that echoed his own journey. The harsh passage from one life to another, the price of survival. He would not make her path easy. The wilderness demanded its toll, and he would ensure she paid it in full. But seeing her there, silhouetted against the night sky, speaking promises to her unborn child, he knew with sudden certainty that she might be one of the rare ones who could truly become a creature of this place. He retreated silently back into the cave before she could discover his presence, leaving Charlotte to her moment of private courage beneath the ancient stars. The education of Charlotte Walsh began at dawn. She was awakened by a firm hand on her shoulder and opened her eyes to find Ethan already dressed and prepared for the day. Without a word, he handed her a small piece of dried meat and a wooden cup of water, then gestured for her to follow him outside. The valley was transformed in the early morning light, shadows retreating as the sun crept over the eastern rim. Ethan led her to the base of the valley wall, pointed to a patch of damp earth and a specific type of broadleaf plant, and handed her a flat, sharp stone. Then he walked away. Charlotte stared at the earth, the plant, and the stone in confusion. Was this a test? A punishment? She had no idea what he expected, but she remembered his promise all too clearly. Complain, and he would leave her behind. So she began to dig, her hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher, baking the valley floor. Charlotte's back ached, her fingers bled, and still she dug, searching for whatever it was Ethan wanted her to find. Finally, her efforts revealed a thick, pale root beneath the plant. Triumph surged through her as she carefully extracted it from the earth. She carried it to Ethan, who sat working on a bow near the cave entrance, and presented it without a word. He took it, examined it with critical eyes, then sliced a piece off with his knife and chewed it. His expression remained unchanged as he handed a piece to Charlotte. It was bitter, but it was wet, a slow trickle of moisture that eased her thirst. Understanding dawned. This was not merely a task, but a lesson. He had not taught her how to find water. He had forced her to discover it for herself. The next day brought another wordless challenge. Ethan took her to a different part of the valley and showed her a series of nearly invisible depressions in the dirt. He pointed to them, then to a rabbit that bounded away at their approach. Without explanation, he spent the morning demonstrating how to weave hemp fibers into a snare, his fingers moving with practiced precision. When he was done, he handed her the materials to make her own and walked away. Charlotte's first attempt was clumsy. the knots loose and ineffective. Frustration built as her fingers, still sore from the previous day's digging, struggled with the unfamiliar task. Twice she had to start over. Once she nearly threw the half-finished snare to the ground in despair, but the memory of her father's condemning face flashed in her mind. Corruption in your blood. No, she would not be weak. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte studied the pattern of the fibers more carefully. By midday, she had created a serviceable, if inelegant, snare. Ethan inspected it without comment, then showed her where to place it along the rabbit trail. The waiting was another lesson in itself, the patience of a hunter, the stillness of one who understood that survival depended on timing as much as skill. Days passed in this manner, each one bringing a new, silent lesson. Ethan did not instruct with words but with demonstrations and expectations. He showed Charlotte how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather from cloud patterns, how to move through the underbrush without disturbing a single branch. Each night, Charlotte collapsed onto her sleeping furs, her body exhausted, but her mind alive with new knowledge. She was learning the language of the wilderness, how to read the subtle signs that meant water nearby, how to move quietly, how to predict weather from the behavior of birds and insects. One evening, as she sat grinding corn on a large flat rock, her back screaming in protest, Charlotte watched Ethan from the corner of her eye. He was working on a bow, meticulously shaping the wood, his focus absolute. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their valley, something changed in his demeanor. For a fleeting moment, the hard mask of the warrior slipped. A profound loneliness, a deep and aching grief clouded his features. It was as if he were looking into a past that was far removed from this harsh existence. Then he reached into the small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a single dried wildflower. Its petals were faded but still intact. He held it in his calloused palm, his thumb stroking it with a tenderness that seemed utterly alien to the man Charlotte had come to know. It was a gesture so private, so filled with unspoken story, that Charlotte felt as if she had trespassed on sacred ground. In that moment, Ethan was not the stoic mountain man, not the harsh taskmaster. He was a man mourning a ghost. He put the flower away as quickly as he had taken it out, his expression once again becoming an unreadable shield. But Charlotte had seen it. She had seen the crack in the stone. It did not make him less frightening, but it made him more human. The following day, while Ethan was out hunting, Charlotte's curiosity led her to explore the deeper recesses of the cave. In a small alcove, partially hidden by a jutting rock, she discovered a wooden box. It was simple but beautifully made, the wood polished smooth by years of handling. She knew she should not open it. This was a violation of the unspoken boundaries between them. But something compelled her, a need to understand the man who held her fate in his hands. The box contained few items: a silver locket with a tiny portrait of a woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile, a small buckskin moccasin, clearly made for a child, a folded piece of paper with a drawing of a family, a man, a woman, and a small girl standing in front of a cabin. The man in the drawing was unmistakably a younger Ethan, but his face was different, open, smiling, untroubled by the weight he now carried. Charlotte carefully replaced everything as she had found it and retreated, her heart heavy with the glimpse into Ethan's past. He had not always been the solitary figure he now presented to the world. He had known love, family, connection, and lost it all. That night, lying on her rough fur, every muscle in her body throbbing, Charlotte felt a confusing mix of emotions. She was still a prisoner of her circumstances, bound to this harsh man by a promise of survival. She resented his coldness, his relentless demands. She missed the simple softness of a mattress, the taste of a cooked meal she hadn't had to bleed for. But as she listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing across the fire, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. It was the hard-won sense of accomplishment. She had survived another day. She had learned. In Pine Ridge, she was a source of shame, her worth determined by the judgment of others. Here in this brutal, honest world, her worth was measured only by her will to live. And for the first time in a very long time, she began to believe she was not as weak as her father had told her she was. The heat of the summer intensified over the following weeks, baking the valley until the very stone seemed to sigh in the oppressive air. The trickle of water that was their lifeline slowed to a reluctant drip, and the game that had been plentiful seemed to vanish into the shimmering heat waves. Charlotte watched as Ethan grew leaner, his face more drawn as he pushed himself further each day, hunting for what little the scorched earth would offer. He never complained, but she saw the toll it was taking. The unspoken tension in their small sanctuary grew with each meager meal. Charlotte learned to stretch what little they had, to find nourishment in plants she would have once dismissed as weeds, to savor every precious drop of water. Her body changed as her pregnancy advanced. The child within her grew stronger, more active, as if defying the harsh conditions of its mother's life. Charlotte's hands, once soft and unmarked, now bore calluses and small scars, badges of her new existence. Her skin darkened under the relentless sun, and her muscles, though lean from limited food, grew taut and responsive. She was changing, not just physically, but in deeper ways. She found herself waking before dawn, attuned to the subtle shift in the air that preceded sunrise. She could identify birds by their calls, predict rain from the scent of the wind, spot the nearly invisible trail of a snake across sand. The skills Ethan had forced her to learn were becoming instinct. One morning, Charlotte discovered a nest of quail eggs hidden in the underbrush, a rare bounty in these lean times. With practiced stealth, she gathered them, careful not to disturb the surrounding vegetation in a way that might alert predators to the nest's location. She presented them to Ethan without ceremony, but she saw the brief flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was the first time she had brought food to their table without being directed to do so. That night, as they shared the small feast, Ethan spoke more than he had in all the weeks prior. "You move differently now," he said, his voice still low and gravelly from disuse. "Less like them." He didn't need to specify who them were, the people of Pine Ridge, the world that had cast her out. Charlotte nodded, understanding the observation was as close to praise as he was likely to offer. "I'm learning to see," she said simply. "What do you see?" he asked, an unexpected question that felt like a test. Charlotte considered carefully before answering. "I see that the juniper on the east side of the valley is dying. Not from drought, but from beetles. I see that the hawk that circles at dusk has a nest with 3 young ones in the high cliffs. I see that you favor your right leg when you've been hunting all day, though you try to hide it." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a deepening, an assessment. "And what do these things tell you?" "That we should harvest the juniper for firewood before the beetles spread to the other trees. That the hawk's hunting territory is rich enough to feed 3 offspring, which means there must be more prey than we've found. And," she hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping, "that you were injured once, badly enough to leave a permanent weakness." He studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting his face in sharp relief. Then he did something Charlotte had never seen before. He smiled. It was a small thing, barely a twitch of his lips, but it transformed his weathered face, revealing for an instant the man he might have been in another life. "The cavalry," he said, his smile fading as quickly as it had appeared. "Gatling gun. I was lucky to keep the leg." The admission stunned Charlotte. It was the first personal information he had volunteered, a tiny window into his past. She wanted to ask more. When had he fought? Which side? How had he come to this place? But she knew better than to press. The small offering was significant enough. Instead, she nodded, acknowledging the confidence without demanding more. "I'll check the eastern slopes tomorrow," she said. "The hawk hunts there most often." The conversation ended there, but something had changed between them. A barrier had been lowered, if not removed entirely. The test came not with a roar, but with a stumble. Ethan returned one evening, just as twilight bled across the sky, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. A bear, cornered and desperate from the drought, had charged him. The gash was deep, and by the next morning, a fever had taken hold. He lay on his furs, his body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the sun, his breathing shallow. Occasionally, he would mutter words in a language Charlotte didn't recognize, perhaps the tongue of his mother's people. He was lost to a world of delirium. For the first time, Charlotte was truly alone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Ethan was the pillar holding up her world, and he was crumbling. Without him, how would she survive? How would she protect her child? The wilderness, which had begun to feel like home under his guidance, suddenly seemed alien and hostile again. Her first instinct was to despair, to curl up and wait for the end that had been hunting her since she left Pine Ridge. But then she looked at him, at the man who had shown her not kindness, but a brutal path to survival. He had not let her die. She would not let him. His lessons, delivered in silence and action, rose from her memory. She saw him pointing out a dull green plant with broad, waxy leaves. This one draws the poison. His voice echoed in her mind, though he had never actually spoken the words, only shown her by crushing a leaf and applying it to a scorpion sting on his own hand. Charlotte searched the valley, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. The sun beat down, but she barely felt it. She was a hunter now, but her prey was a plant. Finally, she found it, growing in the cool shadow of a boulder near the almost dry waterfall. She crushed the leaves between two stones just as she had seen him do, creating a dark, pungent paste. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the crude bandage from his leg. The wound was angry, red and swollen, with ominous streaks beginning to spread upward. Swallowing her fear, she gently cleaned it with precious water from their dwindling supply and applied the paste. Ethan flinched in his fevered sleep but did not wake. That was only the first battle. The second was hunger. Their corn was nearly gone. Ethan's bow and arrows leaned against the cave wall, useless in her untrained hands. But she remembered the rabbits. She remembered the almost invisible trails he had shown her, the way he would stop and point to a patch of disturbed dirt, a sign of their passage. She remembered his hands deftly weaving hemp fibers into a cord, creating a snare that was both simple and ingenious. Her first attempts were clumsy. The fibers pricked her fingers. The knots were loose. She wanted to weep with frustration. The image of her father's condemning face flashed in her mind. Corruption in your blood. No, she would not be weak. She took a deep breath, mimicking the calm focus she had so often observed in Ethan. She started again, her fingers slowly learning the rhythm, the feel of the fibers. She made 3 snares. They were not as perfect as his, but they were strong. She took them to the trails he had shown her and set them, her hands moving with a newfound certainty. The rest of the day was a vigil of fear and hope. She changed Ethan's pace, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. She waited. As night fell, Charlotte found herself speaking to him, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The silence that had been their custom now felt oppressive, threatening. "The first time I saw you," she said softly, "I thought you were death itself coming to claim me. I was ready to go." She dipped a cloth in water and placed it on his forehead. "But you weren't death. You were life, offering the hardest path back to living." She told him about Pine Ridge, about Jacob, about the child growing within her. She spoke of her mother's gentle hands and quiet sadness, of her father's rigid faith, of the dreams she'd once had that now seemed to belong to a different girl entirely. "I'm not her anymore," she whispered. "I don't think I can ever be her again. I don't think I want to be." In the dimness of the cave, with only the small fire for light, Charlotte felt a strange peace descend. Whatever happened, whether Ethan lived or died, whether she survived or perished, she had become someone new in this valley, someone stronger, wilder, more true to the core of her being than she had ever been allowed to be in Pine Ridge. The next morning, as the first rays of sun touched the valley rim, Charlotte went to check the snares. The first was empty. The second was empty. Her heart sank. But the third held a small rabbit. A wave of triumph so powerful it almost brought her to her knees washed over her. It was not a gift. It was not luck. She had earned this. She had listened. She had learned. She had provided. She prepared the animal with Ethan's knife, her actions hesitant but deliberate. The smell of cooking meat filled the cave, rich and life-affirming. By midday, Ethan's fever had begun to break. He woke to the scent, his eyes clear for the first time in 2 days. He looked at Charlotte, at the new paste on his leg, then at the small rabbit cooking over the fire. He said nothing, but his silence was different. The silence of judgment was gone. The silence of indifference was gone. This was a silence of acknowledgement. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movement slow and pained. Charlotte took a piece of the cooked meat and handed it to him. He took it and ate, his eyes never leaving hers. In that shared meal, in that profound quiet, everything changed. Charlotte was no longer the burden. She was no longer the lost girl he had pitied. She had proven her worth not to him, but to herself, and in doing so, had earned something far more valuable than his protection. She had earned his respect. As Ethan recovered, the dynamic between them shifted subtly but significantly. He still led, still taught, but now there was dialogue rather than directive. Charlotte found herself not just following his lessons, but contributing her own observations, asking questions, suggesting alternatives. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Charlotte's curiosity about his past finally overcame her caution. "You said cavalry," she ventured. "You fought in the war?" Ethan was silent for so long that Charlotte thought he would not answer. When he did, his voice was distant, as if speaking from across a great divide of time. "Union Army. I was a scout. My father was Cherokee, my mother white. I belonged to neither world entirely, but the blue coats needed men who could read the land." He poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing upward. "When the war ended, I had nowhere to go. My mother's people didn't want an Indian. My father's people didn't want a man who'd fought for the whites." Charlotte absorbed this, understanding better now the isolation that seemed as much a part of him as his skin. "So you came here?" He shook his head. "Not at first. I tried to live among your kind. I became a doctor of sorts, not trained in schools, but I knew the old ways of healing and learned the new ones from an army surgeon." His face darkened. "I had a wife, Sarah, a daughter, Hannah." The names hung in the air between them, weighted with loss. "What happened to them?" Charlotte asked softly, though she suspected she already knew. "Fever," he said, the single word carrying a world of grief. "The burning sickness that swept through the settlements. I sat with them until their spirits left." He paused, and the sorrow she had glimpsed in his eyes now filled them completely. "When they were gone, my own spirit went with them. I could no longer be among people, among the memories. I became what I am now, a man who walks alone." The simple, devastating story hung in the air, a truth so painful it seemed to make the air shimmer. He had lost everything. She thought of the dried flower he kept, of the locket and child's moccasins she had discovered, treasures from a life that had been consumed by tragedy. Ethan looked at her swollen belly, and his eyes held not judgment, but a shared understanding of loss. "The one who planted that seed," he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "does he carry the burden with you?" Tears Charlotte didn't know she had left welled in her eyes. "He was just a boy," she whispered, "as scared as I was. His family sent him back east on a wagon before my own father even knew. I never saw him again. I was the only one left to be punished." In the quiet that followed, they were no longer a mountain man and a town girl, outcasts in exile. They were just two people stripped bare by sorrow, their tragedies laid out between them. Charlotte saw that his leg was bleeding again, the wound reopened by his movements. Without a word, she went to their small store of supplies, brought the paste and a clean rag, and knelt before him. As she gently cleaned and redressed the wound, her touch was not just that of a student repaying a debt. It was the touch of someone who cared. Ethan watched her, his guard completely down for the first time, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. When she finished, he reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. It was a simple, profound gesture of tenderness. They were no longer bound by a promise of survival. In the crucible of shared danger and shared sorrow, a new bond had been forged. They were a clan of two, and they would face the coming storm together. In the wake of Ethan's recovery, a profound quiet settled in the valley, but it was a quiet of a different kind. The silence of strangers had been replaced by the comfortable peace of companions. The unspoken rules that had governed their existence softened and reshaped themselves into the gentle rhythms of a shared life. A new language grew between them, one spoken in anticipating a need, in a shared glance, in the simple, unspoken understanding of two people who had seen the darkest parts of each other and had not turned away. Ethan's instructions were no longer stark commands. He would show Charlotte a plant and explain how its roots held the morning dew. He would point to the sky and speak of the coming snow. Not as a threat, but as a promise. He was still a man of few words, but the words he chose were now offerings, pieces of his knowledge gifted to her, not forced upon her. As Charlotte's body grew heavier with the child, her movements became slower, more deliberate. She watched as Ethan quietly took on the task that had become difficult for her, collecting firewood from further down the valley, carrying the water skins without her having to ask. His care was a silent, steady presence, a shield against the harshness of the world. These were the days of small tendernesses. Charlotte would find a uniquely colored stone or a fallen eagle feather placed near her sleeping fur, small treasures from Ethan's journeys beyond the valley walls. In return, she took to mending his worn clothes, her stitches clumsy at first but earnest, patching a tear in his sleeve with a strip of cloth from the hem of her own dress. One evening, as the fire danced between them, Ethan began to carve a piece of soft pine wood. For days, he worked on it in the quiet moments, his knife moving with a patient, loving precision. When he was finished, he held it out to Charlotte. It was a small, smooth figurine of a mountain goat, its head tilted as if listening to a secret. It was a toy for her child. Charlotte took it, her fingers tracing the elegant lines, and tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, overwhelming gratitude that left her breathless. This stoic, grieving warrior was making a space in his broken heart for a child that was not his. The toy mountain goat seemed to unlock a door between them, and through it, stories began to flow. Ethan told Charlotte of his own boyhood, of learning to track, not to kill, but to understand the patterns of the world. He shared legends of his people, stories of how the moon was a shy maiden hiding her face from the sun's fierce glare. In the safety of his presence, Charlotte finally found the courage to speak to her unborn child, not in whispers of fear, but in words of hope. She would rest her hands on her belly and tell the baby about the valley, about the hawk that circled overhead, about the quiet, strong man who kept them safe. One night she told Ethan, "I hope the baby has your eyes, so they can see the truth in things." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a fleeting, beautiful thing. The love that grew between them was not a sudden fire, but a slow, creeping vine, wrapping itself around the broken pillars of their lives and drawing them together. It bloomed one night when a nightmare took Charlotte, a shadowy echo of her father's condemnation and the leering faces of men she'd never met, but had feared all her life. She woke with a stifled cry, her heart hammering against her ribs. Instantly, Ethan was awake, his silhouette dark against the dying embers of the fire. He did not speak, but his eyes asked the question. Charlotte had no words to explain the terror. She only knew that the loneliness was a cold, physical ache, a chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. She shifted, moving closer to the warmth of the fire, and he understood. He reached across the small space between their sleeping furs and gently pulled a heavy bear hide over her. His hand rested on her shoulder, a solid, reassuring weight in the darkness. The simple touch was an anchor. It was safety. It was home. Charlotte turned to face him, and in the soft red glow of the coals, their eyes met. The years of pain, of exile, of grief all fell away. There was only this moment, this profound, sacred connection. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, but she did not. She met him halfway. His kiss was not one of passion or desperate need. It was as gentle as the fall of evening light, a soft, reverent touch that spoke of shared sorrows and a future he had never expected to have. It was a promise of protection, a vow of tenderness, an acceptance of this strange, beautiful thing they had built together in the heart of the wilderness. In that moment, they were no longer two separate broken souls. They were one. They had built a fragile shelter of hope, and for the first time the future felt not like a threat but like a sunrise they would get to see together. Their small paradise was a bubble of tranquility, a world spun from mutual trust and the quiet blossoming of love. They measured time by the shifting angle of the sun and the steady growth of the child within Charlotte. But the past is a patient hunter, and it had not forgotten them. The first sign of its approach was a subtle shift in Ethan. He grew still, his head cocked, listening to something Charlotte could not hear. The comfortable peace in his eyes was replaced by the sharp, cold alertness of a warrior. He had been a man at peace. Now he was a sentinel on a wall she couldn't see. "They are coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not need to say who. There was only one party that would hunt Charlotte with such purpose. The trapper she had blinded must have found his way back to civilization, back to Pine Ridge, his tongue weaving a tale of a savage captor and a stolen white girl. And her father, a man whose pride was as brittle as mountain shale, would have seized upon the story, a holy crusade to save his fallen daughter and restore his tarnished name. The choice before them was a precipice. Ethan's instinct was to run, to melt into the harsh wilderness that was his true home. But Charlotte was no longer the girl who could keep pace with him. She was heavy, clumsy, her body preparing for the imminent arrival of their child. To flee would be to expose them, to risk everything on a desperate flight. To stay felt like madness, a lamb waiting for the wolves. "I can lead them away," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the valley entrance. "Give you time." Charlotte looked at him, at the man who had pieced her world back together, and she knew he was offering to sacrifice himself. He would be one man against a posse, a ghost against their guns. The thought of being alone again was more terrifying than any confrontation. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She placed her hand on her belly. "We are a family. We do not leave each other behind. This is our home. We will stand here together." A flicker of surprise, then a deep, resonant pride shone in Ethan's eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. They were united. They would face the storm. Ethan spent the next 2 days preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He moved with the focused efficiency of a man who had faced battle before. He checked his weapons, secured extra supplies in a hidden cache, set simple alarms, strings with small bells attached, along the hidden path to the valley. Charlotte watched him transform back into the warrior he had once been, but now she could see beyond the hardness to the man beneath. The man who had kissed her with gentle reverence. The man who had carved a toy for a child not yet born. On the morning of the third day, one of the bells rang, a tiny sound that carried through the still air like a gunshot. Ethan was instantly alert, motioning for Charlotte to stay in the cave while he moved to a position that gave him a view of the entrance. He returned moments later, his face grim. "2 men," he said. "Hunters, not from your town. They're tracking a deer, but they've found our path. They'll be here soon." The arrival of strangers was an unwelcome complication. Not the righteous fury of Pine Ridge, but perhaps an equally dangerous threat. Unknown variables in their carefully balanced equation of survival. Ethan positioned himself near the cave entrance, partly concealed by an outcropping of rock, but with a clear view of the valley floor. Charlotte stayed deeper in the shadows, her heart racing. She remembered the crude bandage she had applied to Ethan's leg, the fever that had nearly claimed him. They couldn't afford another injury, another vulnerability. The hunters entered the valley cautiously, rifles ready, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar terrain. They were rough men, bearded and weathered, with the hard look of those who made their living from the wilderness. One was tall and thin, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. The other was shorter, but powerfully built, his beard streaked with gray. They spotted the cave almost immediately, their postures changing as they registered signs of human habitation. The taller one called out, his voice echoing against the valley walls. "Hello, the cave! We mean no harm. Just passing through, tracking a buck." Ethan remained silent, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Charlotte held her breath. Perhaps they would move on, satisfied that the valley was empty. But the men approached, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps the promise of company in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. The shorter one was the first to spot Ethan, half hidden by the rocks. He raised his rifle instinctively, then lowered it when he saw Ethan made no move toward a weapon. "Didn't mean to intrude," the man said, his voice gruff but not hostile. "Didn't know anyone was living out here." Ethan stepped forward, his stance casual but ready. Charlotte knew from their time together that he could move from stillness to lethal action in the space of a heartbeat. "Valley's not on any map," Ethan said, his voice neutral. "Not many find it." The taller man nodded, his eyes taking in the details of their camp, the small garden Charlotte had started, the drying racks for meat, the well-worn path to the water pool. "You've got a nice setup here," he said, appreciation in his voice. "Been here long?" Ethan shrugged, non-committal. "Long enough." The exchange might have ended there, a brief, cautious interaction between men who understood the code of the wilderness. But fate had other plans. A small movement from Charlotte, a shift of position to ease the ache in her back, caught the taller man's attention. His eyes narrowed, peering into the shadows of the cave. "You got company back there?" he asked, taking a step forward. Ethan moved slightly, blocking the man's path. "My business." The shorter man chuckled, a rough sound. "No need to be protective, friend. We're not looking to steal your woman." "Unless she's stolen already," the taller one said, his tone suddenly sharper. "Heard a story in town a while back. Preacher's daughter gone missing. Some said she was taken by an Indian." Charlotte felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The hunter was making a connection she hadn't anticipated. Pine Ridge might be days away, but stories traveled, especially stories that combined the scandal of a fallen woman with the fear of the savage other. "I'm no thief," Ethan said, his voice dangerously soft. "Might be best if we saw for ourselves," the taller man said, his hand drifting toward his rifle. "Make sure everything's as it should be." It was a moment balancing on a knife's edge. Charlotte could feel the tension radiating from Ethan, see the calculation in the hunter's eyes. This could end in blood, in death, in the destruction of everything they had built. She made her decision in an instant, stepping forward into the light, her pregnant belly obvious beneath her simple dress. All three men froze, their attention riveted on her unexpected appearance. "I'm Charlotte Walsh," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I wasn't taken. I was cast out. Ethan saved my life when my own people left me to die." The hunter stared, clearly taken aback by her educated speech and the confidence with which she addressed them. "Cast out?" the shorter man repeated, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. "My father is the minister of Pine Ridge," Charlotte explained, moving to stand beside Ethan. "When he discovered my condition, he banished me. Said I carried corruption in my blood." Understanding dawned on the men's faces, followed by an uncomfortable shifting of weight. The moral complexities of the situation were clearly more than they had bargained for when they followed that deer trail. "Well," the taller one said finally, "seems to me what happens between a man and woman is their business, not ours." For a moment it seemed the crisis had passed. The hunters were backing down, ready to continue on their way and leave the strange couple to their secluded life. But then the shorter man's gaze sharpened, focusing on Charlotte's face with sudden recognition. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "I know you. You're the preacher's girl from the poster. There's a reward for information leading to your return. Your father's been searching for months." The atmosphere shifted instantly, a new tension filling the air. The hunters were no longer simply passing through. They were now calculating the value of their discovery. "How much?" the taller one asked, his eyes never leaving Charlotte. $50, his companion replied. "Dead or alive for the Indian. The girl to be brought back unharmed." The casual brutality of it, the reduction of Ethan's life to a bounty and Charlotte's freedom to a transaction, sent a wave of cold fury through her. These men didn't see them as people, but as commodities, opportunities for profit. "I won't go back," Charlotte said, her hand finding Ethan's. "This is my home now. This is where my child will be born." The shorter hunter shook his head, a false sympathy in his expression. "Now, miss, you're not thinking clearly. That's the wildness talking. Your father is a man of God. He wants what's best for you. Come back with us, and all will be forgiven." "Forgiveness isn't his to give," Charlotte replied, her voice hardening. "And I've found more grace in this valley than in all his sermons." The taller hunter's patience visibly waned. "Listen, we can do this easy or hard, but you're coming with us, and we're collecting that bounty." Ethan moved with a speed that belied his years. In one fluid motion, he pushed Charlotte behind him and drew his knife. "She stays," he said, the words final as stone. What happened next was a blur of violence. The taller hunter raised his rifle, but Ethan was already in motion, closing the distance between them with predatory grace. The knife flashed in the sunlight, finding the soft spot beneath the hunter's ribs with deadly precision. The man's eyes widened in shock, his finger squeezing the trigger reflexively. The shot went wild, echoing through the valley like thunder. He crumpled to the ground, blood soaking the front of his shirt, his life already fading. The shorter hunter stumbled backward, fumbling to bring his own rifle to bear. Charlotte reacted without thinking, remembering the plant that had saved Ethan's life. She grabbed a handful of the caustic leaves she had collected for medicine and threw them with all her might into the man's face. His scream was piercing, his hands flying to his eyes as the burning oils did their work. He dropped his rifle, stumbling blindly, curses streaming from his lips. Ethan approached him cautiously, knife still in hand. "Go," he said, his voice cold with controlled rage. "Tell your town what happened here. Tell them the next man who comes hunting us dies slower." The hunter staggered away, still clawing at his eyes, crashing through the underbrush in his blind panic. The valley fell silent again, but it was a silence heavy with the knowledge that their sanctuary had been breached. Their secret was out. Charlotte stared at the body of the fallen hunter, at the blood soaking into the ground of their valley. This man had come to destroy their life, to drag her back to shame and punishment, to kill the man she loved. Yet seeing him lying there, still and empty, filled her with a profound sadness. Not regret, she knew they had no choice, but a mourning for the violence that seemed to follow humanity even into the most remote corners of the wilderness. Ethan knelt beside the body, closing the man's staring eyes with a gentle pass of his hand. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of the gravity of taking a life. Then he looked up at Charlotte, concern etching new lines into his weathered face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, rising to his feet and coming to her side. Charlotte shook her head, suddenly aware of how violently she was trembling. The confrontation had unleashed a flood of emotions: fear, anger, relief, and a terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. "He'll bring others," she said, looking in the direction the blinded hunter had fled. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, but not today. Maybe not tomorrow. We have time to prepare." He led her back to the cave, his arms strong around her shoulders. Inside, he carefully checked her for any signs of injury or distress that might affect the baby. Satisfied that she was physically unharmed, he set about making tea from calming herbs they had gathered. As Charlotte sipped the warm liquid, she felt the trembling in her limbs begin to subside. In its place came a strange, fierce clarity. She had made her choice. She would not be taken back to Pine Ridge, would not subject her child to the judgment and cruelty that awaited them there. If her father and his righteous men wanted her, they would have to face the woman she had become, not the frightened girl they had cast out. "We should bury him," she said quietly, nodding toward the valley where the hunter's body lay. Ethan looked at her, something like surprise in his eyes, followed by a deep understanding. "Yes," he agreed, "we should bury him." Together they dug a grave on the far side of the valley, away from their living space but marked with a simple cairn of stones. Charlotte said a few words, not from her father's Bible, but from her own heart, a prayer for peace and forgiveness that encompassed all the complexity of their situation. As they returned to the cave in the gathering dusk, Ethan took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin, a physical reminder of his presence and protection. "The man I was before would have run," he said softly, his eyes on the distant mountains, "would have disappeared into the wilderness and never looked back." Charlotte squeezed his hand. "Why didn't you?" He turned to her, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because sometimes what's worth protecting is worth fighting for." In the silence that followed, Charlotte felt the baby shift within her, a reminder of the new life that would soon join their small clan. A life that would be born into danger, but also into love. A love forged in the harshest of circumstances, but stronger for it, like steel tempered in fire. "They will come," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Ethan nodded, his eyes returning to the mountains, to the hidden passage that was the only way into their valley. "Yes," he said simply, "they will come." And in those three words was a promise that whatever storm approached, they would weather it together. That the family they had built in this hidden corner of the world was worth any price to defend. That the love that had grown between them, unexpected and profound, would not be easily uprooted. Their small paradise was no longer a secret, no longer safe. But as the stars emerged above them, as the night wrapped around their shoulders like a familiar blanket, Charlotte found that she was not afraid. She had faced abandonment and near death. She had learned to survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. She had found strength she never knew she possessed and love she had never dared to hope for. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside the man who had taught her to see the beauty in the wilderness, both outside and within herself. A voice, achingly familiar and yet utterly alien in their sanctuary, echoed off the valley walls. Charlotte rose. We have come to deliver you. It was her father. His voice was filled with a booming, self-righteous certainty, the voice of a man convinced of his own godliness. He was not here to save her. He was here to reclaim a piece of property, to erase a stain. Charlotte felt the sound reopening a wound she thought had begun to heal, pouring the salt of her old shame and humiliation back into it. For Ethan, the shouts of armed white men intruding upon his land were a visceral echo of the loss, of the relentless encroachment that had destroyed his world. His hand rested on the handle of his knife, his knuckles white. 3 days had passed since the blinded hunter had fled their valley. 3 days of preparation, of planning, of stilling themselves for the inevitable confrontation. They had discussed fleeing, finding a new sanctuary deeper in the wilderness. But Charlotte's advanced pregnancy made such a journey perilous. And something in both of them rebelled against the idea of abandoning the home they had built together. So they had stayed, transforming their peaceful refuge into a defensible position. Ethan had moved their most essential supplies to a hidden cave higher up the valley wall, a place Charlotte could retreat to if the worst happened. He had sharpened his weapons, set subtle traps along the narrow entrance path, taught Charlotte how to use his knife if it came to that. But despite their preparations, the reality of her father's voice, that familiar cadence that had once meant safety and now promised only subjugation, sent a tremor through Charlotte's body. Ethan, sensing her fear, moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. Remember who you are now, he said softly, for her ears alone. Remember what we've built. Charlotte nodded, drawing strength from his words, from the months of harsh lessons and tender discoveries they had shared. She was no longer the terrified girl who had stumbled into this valley half dead. She was a woman who had earned her place in this world, who had found love where she least expected it, who carried new life within her. They stood at the mouth of the cave, watching as her father appeared at the narrow entrance to their valley, flanked by half a dozen men with rifles at the ready. Reverend Walsh had changed in the months since Charlotte had last seen him. His frame seemed thinner, his beard more unkempt, but his eyes burned with the same zealous fire she remembered all too well. What her father saw was not what he had expected. He did not see a frightened captive girl. He saw his daughter standing tall, her pregnant form a testament to a life he had condemned, and beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, was the man he had labeled a savage. They were not captor and victim. They were a fortress. "Father," Charlotte said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the space between them. "You have no right to be here. You cast me out. You left me to die. This is my home now." Her father's face, a mask of righteous fury, twisted in disbelief and rage. He saw her defiance, her lack of shame, and the quiet, unshakable bond between her and Ethan. It was more than he could bear. "You speak with a serpent's tongue taught to you by this heathen," he roared, raising his rifle, its dark metal glinting in the sun. "I will not see my blood defiled. I will cleanse this sin myself." His men followed his lead. The clicks of their cocking rifles echoed like death rattles in the quiet valley. The air grew thick with tension. The moment stretched thin, poised to snap. Ethan pushed Charlotte slightly behind him, ready to absorb the first bullet. Her father's finger tightened on the trigger. And in that instant of unbearable tension, as the world held its breath, a different kind of violence erupted. A white-hot, sharp, and undeniable pain tore through Charlotte's body. She gasped, crying out as her knees buckled, her hands flying to the taut drum of her belly. The world narrowed to that single searing reality. The baby. Her baby was coming now. The first cry of her labor was a sound that broke the world. It shattered the tense standoff, replacing the specter of violence with the raw, undeniable reality of life demanding to be born. The men in her father's posse flinched, their righteous certainty faltering. Their rifles, which had been aimed with such conviction, now seemed heavy and purposeless. This was not the battle they had come to fight. In that moment of hesitation, Ethan became a force of nature. His focus shifted entirely from the men outside to Charlotte. With a strength that belied the urgency of the moment, he swept her into his arms and carried her back into the deeper shadows of their cave. He laid her gently on the softest furs, his movements swift and sure. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a guardian, a midwife, a priest of the oldest rite of all. His voice was a low, calming murmur, a steady anchor in her sea of pain. He spoke in his own tongue, the words unfamiliar, but the tone a universal language of comfort and strength. Outside, her father's voice rose in a furious, desperate shriek. "It is a deception, a devil's ploy to weaken your resolve. Do not listen. Fire upon the cave. Cleanse this place." But his men did not obey. One of them, a weather-beaten man with weary eyes, lowered his rifle completely. "Reverend," he said, his voice strained, "we can't. Not while she's... That ain't right." "She is birthing the spawn of sin," her father roared, his face a grotesque mask of fury. "To hesitate is to side with the damned." But his spell over them was broken. They had followed him into the wilderness to dispense frontier justice. But they would not be the executioners of a woman in childbirth. They were hard men, but they were not monsters. His fanaticism, stripped bare of its pious justifications, was ugly and unsettling. They looked at him not as a leader, but as a madman. Inside the cave, the world had shrunk to the rhythm of Charlotte's own body, a storm of pain and effort. Ethan was with her in the storm, his hands cool on her feverish skin, his presence an unshakable mountain. He was the only thing holding her world together. The agony was immense, a fire that consumed her. But with every wave, she felt his strength flowing into her, saw the fierce determination in his eyes, and knew she was not alone. "Breathe," he instructed, his voice steady, like the wind through the pines, slow and deep. Charlotte focused on his voice, on his eyes, trying to match her breathing to his instructions. The pain came again, stronger this time, and she cried out, unable to contain it. "Good," he said, surprising her. "The pain speaks. Listen to it. It tells you when to push, when to rest. Your body knows the way." His calm confidence was a lifeline. This man who had taught her to read the land was now teaching her to read her own body, to trust in its ancient wisdom. Between contractions, he prepared, heating water, laying out clean cloths, positioning her for the birth. His movements were practiced, efficient, betraying an unexpected familiarity with childbirth. "You've done this before," Charlotte gasped during a brief respite from the pain. Ethan nodded, a shadow passing over his features. "I helped bring Hannah into the world," he said quietly, "and I was there for many births among my mother's people." The revelation touched Charlotte deeply. This glimpse of his past life, of the man he had been before loss, had driven him into isolation. That he would return to those memories, use that knowledge to help her now, was a gift beyond measure. Another contraction seized her, more powerful than any before. Charlotte bore down, feeling as if her body was tearing itself apart. Ethan's hands were there, supporting, guiding. "The head comes," he said, his voice taut with concentration. "One more push, Charlotte. Bring your child into the world." With a final monumental effort that seemed to draw strength from the very core of her being, Charlotte pushed. There was a moment of searing pressure, then a sudden release. A tiny, indignant wail filled the cave, the first voice of her child, announcing its arrival with unmistakable vigor. "A son," Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder as he cradled the tiny squirming form. "Strong and perfect." He cleaned the baby with practiced efficiency, then placed the warm, wrapped bundle in Charlotte's arms. The world outside, her father, his men, the danger that still lurked, all faded to insignificance as she looked into her son's face for the first time. He was beautiful, red-faced and angry at his sudden eviction from the only home he had known, but beautiful beyond words. His eyes, when they briefly opened, were dark like Ethan's, already seeming to hold a wisdom beyond his minutes of life. "Samuel," she whispered, the name coming to her unbidden. Not for the prophet her father had preached about, but for the first man to hear God's voice in the wilderness. "Nathan," Ethan added softly, touching the baby's cheek with gentle reverence. "In my tongue it means gift. He is the gift of the mountain." "Samuel Nathan," Charlotte agreed, tasting the name, feeling its rightness. a man of the new earth and a gift of the mountain. The precious moment of peace was shattered by a commotion at the cave entrance. Charlotte's father, unwilling to be denied his vengeance, had broken away from his hesitant followers and charged toward the cave, his rifle raised. Ethan moved with the fluid grace of a predator, positioning himself between the entrance and his new family. But he did not draw his knife. Instead, he stood tall, unarmed, facing the barrel of the rifle with unflinching courage. "Stop," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "A child has been born. This ground is sacred now." Reverend Walsh halted at the threshold, his eyes wild, his breathing ragged. The rifle wavered in his hands as he took in the scene before him, his daughter cradling a newborn, the man he had come to kill standing between them like a guardian spirit. "Move aside," the Reverend snarled, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. "I've come for my daughter." "She is not yours," Ethan replied, his tone even. "She belongs to herself, to the child, to the life she has chosen." "Chosen? Wow." The Reverend's laugh was harsh, brittle. "She was seduced by sin, corrupted by love," Charlotte interrupted, her voice weak but resolute. She shifted, allowing her father to see the infant in her arms. "This is your grandson, father. Samuel Nathan, born of love, not sin. Look at him and tell me God did not have a hand in creating something so perfect." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in her father's eyes. A shadow of doubt, perhaps, or a distant memory of his own child's birth. But it was quickly subsumed by the familiar fire of his zealotry. "That creature is no kin of mine," he spat. "It is an abomination, as is the union that spawned it." He raised the rifle again, its barrel pointing not at Ethan now, but at the tiny bundle in Charlotte's arms. It was a gesture so monstrous, so beyond the bounds of humanity, that even Ethan seemed momentarily stunned by its depravity. "Jonathan Walsh!" The new voice, cracking with age, but vibrant with authority, came from the valley entrance. All heads turned to see an elderly woman making her way toward the cave, supported by one of the men from the posse. She was small and bent with age, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun, her black dress dusty from the journey. Charlotte gasped in recognition. It was Mrs. Thompson, the midwife who had brought Charlotte herself into the world 18 years ago. The old woman had been ancient even then, a fixture in Pine Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. "Mrs. Thompson?" Charlotte's father faltered, clearly unprepared for this unexpected intrusion. "What are you doing here? This is no place for—" "I go where I'm needed, Reverend," the old woman cut him off sharply. "And it seems I'm needed here to remind a man of God what true Christianity looks like." She hobbled closer, her piercing eyes taking in the tableau of Charlotte, the baby, and Ethan. "I see I'm too late for the birth. A pity. I would have liked to welcome another generation into the world." She turned her attention back to Reverend Walsh, her expression hardening. "Lower that rifle, Jonathan. You're making a spectacle of yourself." Incredibly, he obeyed, the weapon dropping to his side as if suddenly too heavy to hold. There was something in his reaction to the old woman that spoke of deep-rooted respect, or perhaps fear, a vulnerability Charlotte had never witnessed in her father before. Mrs. Thompson made her way to Charlotte's side, inspecting the baby with experienced eyes. "A fine boy," she pronounced. "Strong lungs, good color." She touched Charlotte's forehead gently. "And you've come through well, child. Better than many with proper beds and doctors." She glanced at Ethan, a knowing look passing between them. "You've done well by her," she said simply. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. The old woman's presence had transformed the dynamic completely. Her authority, built on decades of bringing life into the world, seemed to outweigh even the Reverend's religious fervor. She turned to face him again, her small frame somehow imposing despite her years. "It's time for truth, Jonathan," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the valley. "Time to end this charade." "I don't know what you're talking about," the Reverend replied, but there was a new tension in his stance, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "I speak of Rose," Mrs. Thompson said simply. "I speak of your wife, and the real reason for your hatred of this good man." She gestured to Ethan. "I speak of the lie you've lived these 18 years. A shocked silence fell over the valley. Charlotte felt a cold prickle of anticipation. This was it, the mystery that had shadowed her life, the secret behind her father's final words as he cast her out. You have your mother's corruption in your blood. Rose died of fever, her father said stiffly. Everyone knows that. Mrs. Thompson's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. The fever of a broken heart, perhaps. We all saw the bruises, Jonathan. We all heard her weeping, but we kept silent. God forgive us, out of respect for your position, out of fear. She moved closer to him, each word precise and cutting. Rose didn't die of fever. She took her own life after you beat her for daring to seek help for her consumption from the Indian doctor who had saved half the town from the influenza. The same man who stands before you now. Is this true? Charlotte whispered, looking at Ethan. Ethan's eyes held a profound sadness. Yes, he said softly. During the influenza outbreak of '73, I came to Pine Ridge with medicines. Many were suspicious, but others were desperate enough to seek my help. When the sickness popped, most forgot their gratitude, but your mother remembered. She came to me in secret when her consumption worsened, he continued. Not just because the town doctor had given up, but because she saw me as a person, not just a useful savage. His voice held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of how the world worked. She was curious about my people's ways, asked questions no white woman had ever bothered to ask. She brought cookies, he added, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Said a healer deserves sweetness in return for easing bitterness. Reverend Walsh's face contorted with rage. She betrayed her faith, her family, consorting with someone who could help her breathe? Mrs. Thompson cut in sharply. There was nothing improper in their meetings, Jonathan. Only your twisted minds saw sin where there was only human decency. The last time I saw her, Ethan said, his eyes fixed on Charlotte, she gave me a small book of poetry, said it had helped her find beauty in darkness. 2 days later, I heard she was gone. I never knew. He looked at Reverend Walsh, and for the first time, raw emotion cracked through his composed exterior. I never knew you had beaten her for coming to me. I never knew she died by her own hand. Charlotte felt the pieces falling into place. Her father's hatred of Ethan, his obsession with rooting out her corruption, his desperate need to reclaim her. It wasn't just about his reputation or even his rigid faith. It was guilt. Guilt and fear that the truth of what he had done would come to light. Charlotte's world tilted on its axis. She looked at Ethan, who stood utterly still, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He had known her mother, had tried to heal her, and her father had punished Rose for seeking that help, had driven her to such despair that she had ended her own life. Lies, Reverend Walsh hissed, but there was no conviction in his voice, just fear, the fear of a man whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. His eyes darted between Mrs. Thompson and Ethan, a cornered animal seeking escape. She was confused, weakened by her illness. He filled her mind with pagan nonsense about spirits and healing plants. She couldn't think clearly. She thought clearly enough, Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice hard as granite. Clear enough to leave a letter naming you as the cause of her despair. A letter I've kept safe these 10 years, Jonathan. A letter that would destroy you if the town ever saw it. I was there, Mrs. Thompson continued relentlessly. I found her body. I cleaned her wounds, both the ones she inflicted on herself and the ones you gave her. I heard her last confession. Jonathan, I know what she suffered at your hands. Ethan's entire body went rigid. His face, usually so controlled, contorted with a flash of raw anguish. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Rose took her own life. The words seemed to physically pain him. He turned away sharply, one hand coming up to cover his eyes. I gave her medicine for her lungs. I told her to return if she worsened. I never knew. His voice broke. I could have helped her. Should have seen the deeper wounds. He drew a ragged breath and turned back to face Reverend Walsh, grief hardening into something dangerous in his eyes. You denied her even the dignity of her true death. You let your daughter believe a lie. Mrs. Thompson placed a weathered hand on Ethan's arm, steadying him. She turned to Charlotte, her eyes softening with compassion. Your mother was a good woman, child, kind and gentle, with a heart too big for the small minds of Pine Ridge. She saw goodness where your father saw only sin. She reached across the boundaries that men like him built to keep us separate and afraid. The corruption he speaks of, she continued, her gaze returning to the Reverend, was nothing more than human decency, the courage to see beyond fear and prejudice. Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face, tears for the mother she had barely known, for the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. She looked down at her son, at his perfect face now peaceful in sleep, and felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. No one would ever make him ashamed of his heritage, of his parentage. No one would twist his spirit with fear and dogma as her father had twisted hers. Is this true? She asked her father, her voice steady despite her tears. Did my mother die by her own hand because of your cruelty? For the first time, Reverend Walsh seemed to shrink, the zealous fire in his eyes dimming to embers. He looked old suddenly, diminished. Rose was confused, he said weakly. She could not discern God's will from the devil's temptation. I tried to save her soul. By breaking her body? Mrs. Thompson's voice was razor sharp. By crushing her spirit? I loved her. The words burst from him, raw and anguished. Everything I did was out of love. That was not love, Ethan spoke at last, his deep voice resonant with a sorrow that seemed to transcend the immediate conflict. I knew your wife only briefly, when she came seeking treatment for her cough. But in those few visits, I saw a woman of rare compassion and wisdom. She spoke of you with both fear and hope. Hope that you might someday see beyond the prison of your beliefs to the larger truth of God's creation. He moved forward, not threateningly, but with the steady purpose of a man who had found his center. I have lived among many peoples, Reverend. I have heard many versions of God's word. And the one truth I have found is this: any faith that requires you to hate, to hurt, to divide, that is not faith. It is fear wearing faith's mask. Charlotte's father seemed to waver, as if Ethan's words had struck some long-buried chord within him. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Charlotte thought she glimpsed the man her mother might have loved, before bitterness and fear had twisted him. But then his face hardened again, the momentary vulnerability sealed away. He raised his rifle once more, aiming directly at Ethan's heart. Enough of your heathen philosophy, he snarled. Step aside. I'm taking my daughter back to civilization where she belongs. I belong here, Charlotte said firmly, clutching Samuel closer. With the man who saved me when you left me to die. With the man who showed me more of God's love in his silence than you ever did in your sermons. You are bewitched, her father insisted, his knuckles white on the rifle. But I will save you, even against your will. The tension in the cave was unbearable. Charlotte could feel Ethan's readiness to move, to protect her and the child at any cost. She could see her father's finger tightening on the trigger, his decision made. And then, from the bundle in her arms, came a sound, a small, perfect cry. Samuel's voice, piercing the conflict like a shaft of light through darkness. It was not a cry of distress, but of presence, of life announcing itself in a world that had forgotten its wonder. The sound froze everyone in place. Even her father seemed transfixed, his eyes drawn inexorably to the source of the cry. Samuel's tiny hands had worked free of his swaddling, reaching up toward the light that filtered through the cave entrance. In that moment of suspended time, Mrs. Thompson made her move. With a swiftness belying her age, she stepped in front of the Reverend's rifle. If you want to kill that man, she said, her voice quiet but implacable, you'll have to shoot through me first. And then you'll have to explain to all of Pine Ridge how you murdered its oldest citizen to satisfy your pride. The men who had accompanied the Reverend, already uncomfortable with the turn of events, moved forward as one. The weather-beaten man who had first lowered his rifle spoke for them all. Put the gun down, Reverend, he said, not unkindly but with firm resolve. This has gone far enough. We came to rescue a girl who doesn't need rescuing. We came to punish a man who's done no wrong that I can see. There's nothing more for us here. Faced with the defection of his entire party, Reverend Walsh seemed to deflate. The rifle barrel lowered slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of defeat. You've made your choice then, he said to Charlotte, his voice hollow. You choose this wilderness over your home, this savage over your own blood. Charlotte looked at him, this man who had raised her, who had both loved and damaged her, who had shaped her life in ways both terrible and profound. She felt not hatred, but a deep, sorrowful pity. I choose love, Father, she said softly. I choose the path that makes me more, not less. I choose a home where my son can grow strong in body and spirit without shame or fear. She paused, cradling Samuel closer. And you will always be welcome in that home if you come in peace. He is your grandson, after all. Your blood flows in his veins alongside Ethan's. For a moment, it seemed her words might reach him. Something flickered in his eyes, longing perhaps, or recognition of the daughter he had once cherished. But then his jaw set, his expression hardening into the familiar mask of righteous certainty. I have no grandson, he said coldly. I have no daughter. May God have mercy on your souls. He turned and strode from the cave, his back rigid with pride. The other men followed, some casting apologetic glances back at Charlotte, others simply looking relieved to be leaving. Mrs. Thompson remained, her weathered hand coming to rest on Charlotte's arm. He may change in time, she said gently. Grief and pride are powerful blinders, but even they cannot stand forever against love. She smiled down at Samuel. This little one has a way of working miracles, I suspect. Charlotte nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Thank you, she managed finally, for coming, for speaking the truth. The old woman's smile deepened, revealing a glimpse of the girl she had once been. Truth has been my business for 83 years, child. Too old to change now. She patted Charlotte's hand. I'll come visit when the snows melt to see how this young man is growing, if that's acceptable to you both. Ethan, who had remained watchful throughout the confrontation, finally relaxed his stance. You will always be welcome here, he said, with a formal courtesy that spoke of his respect for the old midwife. The valley is yours to visit whenever you wish. Mrs. Thompson nodded, satisfied. I'll hold you to that. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and I brought some things for the baby. Blankets, clothes, a proper cradle. They're with the horses. I had faith we'd need them. After she had gone, following the path taken by the others, Ethan and Charlotte were left alone with their son. The danger had passed, leaving in its wake a fragile peace, a new beginning. Ethan moved to Charlotte's side, sitting beside her on the furs. He looked down at Samuel, his expression full of wonder and a fierce protectiveness. Are you all right? He asked, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Charlotte considered the question. She was exhausted, sore from childbirth, shaken by the confrontations and revelations of the day. But beneath all that, there was a core of serene certainty. This was where she belonged. This was her family. Yes, she said simply. I am now. Ethan's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her against his solid warmth. Your mother would be proud of you, he said softly. You have her courage, her clarity of vision. The mention of her mother brought fresh tears to Charlotte's eyes, but they were healing tears, washing away old pain. Tell me about her, she asked. The little you knew. Ethan was quiet for a moment, gathering his memories. She came to me 3 times, he began. The first, she was frightened but determined. Her cough had worsened, and the town doctor had given her little hope. She had heard that I had medicines the white doctors did not. He smiled slightly. She brought me cookies, said it was poor payment for medicine, but it was what she could manage away from your father's eyes. I told her no payment was necessary, but she insisted, said every exchange should honor both parties. Charlotte smiled through her tears, imagining her mother's gentle insistence. It felt right somehow, the small act of kindness and respect. The second visit, the medicines had helped her breathing, but she was troubled in spirit. She spoke of you, of her fears for your future in your father's house. She saw his harshness affecting you, making you smaller, more afraid. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. The last time, she knew she was dying. Not just from the consumption, but from a deeper sickness of the soul. She asked me if I believed in an afterlife. I told her my people believe that the spirit continues its journey, that death is just a doorway to the next valley. She liked that idea, a new valley where she could breathe freely again. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the image wash over her, her mother finding peace in a place without pain or fear. Do you think she's there now, in that valley? Ethan's arm tightened around her. I believe she is. And I believe she watches over you, over both of you. He touched Samuel's tiny hand with gentle reverence. They sat in companionable silence. 3 generations of a new family, bound not by convention or expectation, but by choice and love. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the valley in the soft gold of evening. It was the end of a day, but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. As darkness fell, Ethan built up the fire, its warm light creating a circle of safety and comfort in the gathering shadows. Charlotte nursed Samuel, marveling at this most ancient of connections, at her body's knowledge of how to sustain the life it had created. I thought of running, Ethan said suddenly, his voice quiet in the firelit cave. When I first realized your father would come, my instinct was to disappear, to vanish back into the wilderness where no white man could find me. Charlotte looked up at him, understanding the admission's significance. What changed your mind? His eyes met hers, dark and bottomless in the flickering light. You did. The way you stood your ground, claimed this place as your home. The way you chose to fight rather than flee. He smiled, a rare transformative expression that made him look younger, unburdened. You taught me that sometimes standing still requires more courage than running away. Charlotte reached for his hand, twining her fingers through his. We've both learned from each other, she said softly. You taught me to survive. I reminded you why survival matters. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. When Sarah and Hannah died, I thought my heart died with them. I became a ghost, haunting these mountains, neither living nor dead, just existing. He looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully against Charlotte's breast. I never expected to feel again. Never expected to find a new clan, a new reason to wake each morning. He touched the baby's head, his calloused fingertips impossibly gentle against the downy hair. This little one, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He is not my blood, but he is my son in all the ways that matter. I will teach him to read the land, to honor its spirits, to walk in balance between worlds as I never could. Charlotte felt her heart swell with love for this complex, wounded, beautiful man who had saved her life, and then, slowly and unexpectedly, her soul. And I will teach him that strength comes in many forms, she said. That kindness is not weakness. That love is the greatest power we possess. Ethan smiled, leaning forward to place a soft kiss on her forehead. He will be a bridge, he said, between your world and mine, between the past and a future we can only imagine. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its plaintive cry echoing across the moonlit valley. Samuel stirred, his tiny face scrunching in momentary concern, then relaxed again, secure in his mother's arms. He knows he's safe, Ethan observed. Already he understands he belongs here, in this place between worlds. Charlotte nodded, feeling a profound peace settle over her. The journey that had begun in shame and exile had led her here, to this moment of perfect belonging. Her father's rejection had been not an ending, but a beginning, the first step on a path that had brought her to true family, true home. What happens now, she asked, not with fear, but with curiosity. The future stretched before them, unknown but full of possibility. Ethan's gaze moved to the cave entrance, to the stars visible beyond. Now we live, he said simply. We raise our son, we hunt and gather and grow. We create something new from what was broken. He was silent for a moment, considering. Perhaps others will come in time. Those who, like us, have found no place in the world of towns and churches. Those seeking a different way. He looked at her questioningly. Would that be acceptable to you? To make our valley a sanctuary for others? Charlotte thought about it, imagining their small family expanding to include other outcasts, other seekers. A community built not on judgment, but on mutual respect and support. It was a vision full of hope and purpose. Yes, she said, feeling the rightness of it deep in her bones. This place saved us both. Perhaps it can save others. Ethan nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. Then that will be our work, when you are stronger. When Samuel is a little older, we will build something here that has never existed before. A place between two worlds, where both are honored. Charlotte leaned against him, fatigue finally overtaking her. The day had been long, filled with pain and fear and joy and resolution. Her body craved rest, healing sleep. Ethan seemed to sense her exhaustion. With gentle efficiency, he helped her lie down more comfortably, arranging the furs around her and Samuel. He added wood to the fire, ensuring it would burn through the night, providing warmth and protection. Then he stretched out beside them, one arm protective around Charlotte's shoulders, his other hand resting lightly on Samuel's swaddled form. The three of them formed a perfect circle, complete and self-contained. And as sleep began to claim her, Charlotte reflected on the strange, miraculous journey that had brought her to this place. She had been cast out, abandoned, left to die in the wilderness. Yet in that seeming punishment, she had found salvation. In losing everything she had known, she had discovered everything she needed. The silence in my heart was a sickness, Ethan murmured, his voice soft in the darkened cave. For a long time, I thought the only cure was to forget. But this child, his cries do not erase the quiet. They build a new song within it. He shifted slightly, his lips brushing her temple. You have taught me that a heart can break and still grow strong enough to hold a new life. Charlotte smiled, her eyes drifting closed. They had saved each other, not by erasing their scars, but by learning to see the beauty in them. Their love story was not written in flowery prose or whispered promises, but in shared hardship, in fierce protection, and in the profound, quiet moments of grace they had found in the wilderness. The next evening, they stood at the edge of the valley, watching the sunset. Ethan held Samuel Nathan against his chest, the baby's small head resting over his heart. Charlotte leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapping around her. They were three outcasts, a warrior who had lost his tribe, a girl who had been abandoned by her town, and a child who belonged to both and neither. But standing there under the vast and holy mountain sky, they were not defined by what they had lost. They were defined by what they had built. They were a family. They were a nation of their own. And they were finally, undeniably home. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared, Charlotte felt a sensation she had almost forgotten. Hope, pure and uncomplicated. Hope for tomorrow, for all the tomorrows that would follow. Hope for the small, perfect life they had created together in this hidden corner of the world. Look, Ethan said softly, pointing to where the evening star hung bright above the mountain ridge. The first light, the guide for travelers coming home. Charlotte followed his gaze, feeling the rightness of his words. They had been travelers, both of them, lost in different ways, following different paths. But they had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. Samuel stirred against Ethan's chest, making the small, contented sounds of a baby secure in his world. His tiny hand closed around Ethan's finger, a gesture of perfect trust that brought a look of wonder to the weathered face of the mountain man. He knows you, Charlotte said, watching the interaction with a full heart. He already knows you will never let him fall. Ethan looked down at the child, then at Charlotte, his eyes reflecting the first stars of evening. Nor you, he said simply. Neither of you will ever fall while I stand. It was a promise, a vow more binding than any spoken in churches or before witnesses. It was a covenant made in the wilderness, sealed with shared survival and newfound love. It was the promise of the valley, that what had once been broken could be made whole, that what had been lost could be found again, that out of abandonment and exile could come the most profound belonging. As night fell completely, wrapping the valley in darkness broken only by starlight, they turned back toward their cave, their home. The path was familiar now, even in the dark, a testament to how much they had learned, how far they had come from those first desperate days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new joys. Samuel would grow, the seasons would turn, the valley would continue its ancient rhythms. And they would be here, part of it all, writing their story day by day in this place that had saved them both. Charlotte took Ethan's free hand as they walked, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grip. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into this valley half dead. She was a woman who had found her power, her voice, her home. She was a mother, a partner, a survivor. Thank you, she said softly to Ethan, to the night, to whatever fate or providence had brought them together. Ethan squeezed her hand gently in response. No further words were needed. They had found a language beyond speech, an understanding that transcended conventional bonds. They had found, in each other, the one thing both had thought forever lost, a place to belong, completely and without reservation. As they entered their cave, the fire still burning low and welcoming, Charlotte felt the truth settle into her bones. Simple and profound. This was home. Not the town that had cast her out, not the faith that had condemned her, but this wild, honest place where she had learned to be truly herself. With Ethan and Samuel beside her, she was finally completely home. In the quiet of the night, as Samuel slept peacefully and Ethan's steady breathing joined the gentle symphony of the wilderness, Charlotte offered up a silent prayer, not to the wrathful God of her father, but to the greater spirit she had come to recognize in the mountains, the valleys, the stars, and most of all, in love itself. Thank you, she thought, for bringing me here, for showing me that sometimes what looks like the end of everything is just the beginning of what matters most. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the ancient wisdom of the wilderness, that life finds a way, that broken things can mend, that even in the harshest landscapes, love can take root and flourish. And in that knowledge, Charlotte Walsh, cast out, abandoned, reborn, found her final peace.